When a woman gave birth to a son, she was to be ritualistically impure for 7 days with the same ritualistic impurity as when she was experiencing her menstrual cycle. She then was to wait an additional 33 days to be purified from her blood, during which time she was to abstain from touching any holy thing or entering the courtyard of the tabernacle. On the 8th day after birth, the baby was to undergo a brit milah, or the rite of circumcision. However, if she gave birth to a daughter, she was to be ritualistically impure for 14 days, with the same ritualistic impurity as when she was experiencing her menstrual cycle. She then was to wait an additional 66 days to be purified from her blood, during which time she was likewise to abstain from touching any holy thing or entering the courtyard of the tabernacle. When the days of the mother's purification were over, whether for a son or for a daughter, she was to bring a lamb in its first year for a burnt offering and young pigeon or dove for a sin offering. The priest would offer the sin offering before Adonai and make atonement for her. If she could not afford a lamb, she was to take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons. One of these would be used for a burnt offering and the other for the sin offering. If someone developed a swelling, scab, or bright spot which could develop into the disease Sefirat, he or she was to be brought to Aaron or to one of his sons. During the examination, the priest was to determine if the hair in the sore had turned white or appeared to go deeper into the skin. If it was true, the priest was to declare the man or woman unclean, as he or she had Sefirat. If the bright spot was white, but it did not appear to go deeper than the skin, and its hair had not turned white, the person was to be quarantined for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest was to examine the person again. If the sore appeared to have spread further on the skin, the priest was to declare the person ritualistically impure, as they had Sefirat. However, if the sore appeared the same as before and had not spread on the skin, then the person was to be quarantined for an additional 7 days. On the 14th day, the priest was to examine the person again, and if the sore had faded and had not spread on the skin, then they would be declared ritualistically pure. It would be determined to be a scab, and the individual was to wash their clothes. If a person had Sefirat, he was to be brought to the priest. The priest was to examine him. Should the priest have found the man to have a white swelling in inflamed flesh and the hair within the area had turned white, the priest was to pronounce the man ritualistically impure with chronic Sefirat. Should the priest have found that the Sefirat had broken out all over the body of the man as far as the priest could see, effectively making his entire body white, the priest was to pronounce the person with the sores ritualistically pure. If the ritualistically pure person was to one day be found to have inflamed flesh, he was to be examined by a priest. If the priest confirmed it to be inflamed, he was to declare the man as ritualistically impure with Sefirat. If the sores had turned white, the man was to be declared ritualistically pure. If a person had on his skin a boil that healed in a manner that left a white swelling or a reddish white bright spot, a priest was to examine it. If the priest found it to be more than the skin deep and the hair in the area had turned white, then the priest was to pronounce the man ritualistically impure with Sefirat, which had broken out in the boil. If the swelling or reddish white bright spot was not more than skin deep, but appeared faded, the priest was to quarantine the man for 7 days. Should the swelling or bright spot spread during the week, the priest was to declare the man ritualistically impure with Zeret. Whereas if there was no change, the man simply had a scar from the boil, and the priest was to declare the man ritualistically pure. Leviticus 12:1 through 13:23. When 4 men with Zerah entered the camp of Aram, they found it to be abandoned. The evening before, the Armenians heard the sound of chariots and horses and fled, believing that King Jehoram had hired Egyptian and Hittite mercenaries. The men with Zerah entered one of the tents on the outskirts of the camp and plundered it. However, they realized that after plundering a second tent, they should inform Samaria of this development. Upon informing the gatekeepers of the city, Jehoram was informed that the enemy camp seemed to have been abandoned. After the advisors believed it to be a trick, Jehoram sent scouts out to survey the countryside. The scouts found Armenian armor and clothing strewn from the camp to the Jordan River. When the scouts informed the king, the populace of Samaria ransacked the camp of Aram. This permitted them to sell 6 quarts of fine flour and half a bushel of barley for $6.26 each. The servant who had challenged the revelation that the prophet had spoken was put in charge of the gate. However, he was trampled to death by the starving throngs. 2 Kings 7:3 through 20. After Yeshua had come down from the hill, large crowds followed him. Then a man afflicted with Zerah came, kneeled down in front of him, and said, "Sir, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Yeshua reached out his hand, touched him, and said, "I am willing, be cleansed." And at once he was cleansed from his Zerah. Then Yeshua said to him, "See that you tell no one, but as a testimony to the people, go and tell the Kohen to examine you and offer the sacrifice that Moshe commanded." Matthew 8:1 through 4.